The sky over Regensburg is no longer blue. It is a bruised, oily canvas of soot and iron. The date was April 21, 1945. Inside the heavy bomber, named the Black Cat, the temperature has plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Howard Goodner feels the rime ice crusting on his oxygen mask. The rhythmic metallic hiss and click of the regulator is the only thing tethering him to the conscious world. The air inside the fuselage reeks of spent cordite, frozen sweat, and the sharp ozone tang of high-altitude electricity. 4 massive engines produce a relentless bone-shaking rumble that feels less like sound and more like an earthquake occurring inside the marrow of the crew. In the cramped, freezing nose of the ship, the navigator hunches over his charts. He sees the red circles marking a hornet's nest of radar-directed 88mm flak batteries. He knows the mission has been recalled. He knows the weather is a solid slab of leaden cloud. His voice, distorted and thin through the interphone, carries a frantic urgency as he warns of the lethal defenses dead ahead. But in the pilot's seat, the command authority has calcified. The command pilot remains a statue of rigid, bureaucratic resolve. "I am leading this mission," he barks back, his voice a jagged edge cutting through the static. He maintains the course, steering 30 tons of aluminum and high explosives directly into the mouth of the trap. Then comes the whoomp. It is not the roar of an explosion, but a hollow, sickening clatter, like a bucket of heavy rocks thrown against a metal bin. A thunderous roar erupts as a jet of orange flame spears through the wing. The Black Cat does not just fall, it ruptures. The world flips upside down in a dizzying, violent rotation. Centrifugal force becomes an anvil, pinning the men against the floorboards as their lungs strain against a pressure that feels like a physical weight. In those final seconds, the metallic shrieking of the dying aircraft, the sound of rivets popping and metal snapping, drowns out everything else. The high adventure has ended in a terminal, screaming lurch toward the earth. But to understand how Howard Goodner found himself in that disintegrating metal coffin, we must look back to the quiet, sun-dappled stillness of Tennessee. Before the storm, his world was a place of blossoms and the humid stillness of a back porch, where his mother fed transient men during the lean years. It was an insular, almost magical life that felt permanent, until the draft began to dismantle it. The transition was a jarring, industrial process. One afternoon, Howard was a college student. The next, he was one of over 100 local boys standing on a train station platform. They were a sea of civilian clothes and uncertain faces destined to be processed into the cold, technical language of the American Air Forces. The military machine did not want individuals. It wanted interchangeable parts. It was a dehumanizing conveyor belt of conditioning that began in the luxury hotels of Miami Beach. The recruits slogged through endless lines in the heat, their lives suddenly contained within sterile medical files and repetitive examinations. This was the industrialization of men. They were no longer sons of the South. They were raw material being funneled into a massive, lethal weapon system. Howard's path took him to Illinois for 18 weeks of radio training. The environment was defined by the relentless metallic chirping of Morse code that filled the barracks like a swarm of angry bees. He spent his days hunched over radio sets, mastering the heat of vacuum tubes, amplifiers, and transformers. Amidst the frustration of cluttered dorm rooms and the anxiety of the draft, Howard faced a pivotal choice. Because of his proficiency, he was offered a safe way out, a position as an instructor. He could have stayed in the States, slept in a warm bed, and watched the war from a distance. Instead, he looked at the smart leather brim of his hat in his portrait and chose the active combat assignment. He chose the B-24, the flying coffin with its 110-foot wingspan and its reputation for being unlovable and unforgiving. He was a young man standing alongside peers like 19-year-old Albert Seradarian, training to operate machines whose engines emitted a deep, distant rumbling. They were being forged into a singular, functioning weapon. The process culminated in a high-stakes casting call where disparate personalities were forced to mesh. They were boys aged 18 to 20, trapped in a holding pattern of waiting and psychological weight. They were being prepared for a claustrophobic existence, trained to tuck into tight formations in skies that would soon be filled with sooty black smudges of flak. Howard Goodner had traded the safety of the home front for the wings of the morning. He had stepped onto a path that would lead him from the quiet hills of Tennessee to the violent, freezing void over Regensburg. The transition from the classroom to the cockpit was a brutal awakening. The men soon realized the Liberator was not the sleek icon of Hollywood propaganda, but a temperamental and unlovable beast. At Westover Field, the training pipeline became a meat grinder. The glamour of the Air Corps evaporated in the sub-zero, oxygen-deprived thinness of the Massachusetts sky. Pilots found themselves wrestling with a machine so notoriously sensitive that its wing could fail under the slightest structural stress. This was not flight. It was a mechanical struggle for survival. At 38,000 feet, where the temperature plummeted to 35 degrees below zero, the human body began to fail. Oxygen systems iced over with a terrifying, silent efficiency. The smell of thin, cold mountain air mingled with the metallic scent of frost on the fuselage. The stakes were absolute. A 40% pilot failure rate during training alone underscored a grim truth. The war was already killing them before they even saw the enemy. By early September 1944, the technical training gave way to a shuddering succession of partings. This was the final furlough, a brief and agonizing window where the men were allowed to return to the world they were about to defend. For Howard, the homecoming was anchored in the humid stillness of Tennessee. The world he found was one of agonizingly beautiful mundanity. The sight of red blossoms pressing against a screen door, and the smell of wood smoke. It was a quiet, heavy rhythm of family lunches, where no one spoke of the impending October departure. The moment of leaving felt like a handful of marbles dropped onto a hardwood floor, scattering in every direction with a sudden clattering finality. As Howard pulled away from the curb, he looked back to see his mother standing on the porch, her figure shrinking into the distance. It was a scene etched in the topography of memory, a recognition that the cord was being cut. Other men felt it too, leaving behind the echoes of minor league baseball careers and the memories of home runs. These men were not just leaving towns. They were leaving their identities as sons, athletes, and students. They were being stripped down to their serial numbers. They were being prepared for the industrial scale of the Atlantic crossing. On October 4, 1944, the industrialization of these young men became a crushing physical weight. The crew stood on Pier 40 in New York, staring up at the massive hull of the New Amsterdam. Once a luxury liner defined by champagne and elegance, the ship had been gutted and transformed into a dismal, overcrowded transport. 12,000 men were sardined into its bowels. For Howard and his crew, the camaraderie of the training ground was replaced by the sensory nightmare of the hold. They were packed 12 men to a cabin designed for only 2. They slept in 4-tiered bunks where the only view was the sagging, sweat-stained canvas of a bunk 6 inches above a soldier's face. The crossing was a 10-day exercise in dehumanization. The air below decks was a thick, viscous soup of oil fumes, unwashed bodies, and the sour, pervasive stench of seasickness. To wash, the men were issued seawater soap, a harsh chemical compound that failed to lather and instead left their skin covered in stinging, angry red rashes. The latrines were slick with puddles of vomit. A dull presentiment of dread hung over everyone, a feeling Howard described as a persistent, low-grade toothache. The ship zigzagged across the Atlantic at 30 knots, a high-speed sprint to evade German submarine wolf packs that left the men feeling like prey. To keep the madness at bay, the men retreated into a world of desperate, escapist rituals. In the cramped cabins, Bob Peterson argued the merits of Frank Sinatra versus Bing Crosby to drown out the rhythmic, metallic pulsing of the engines. In the corners of the mess hall, a soldier named Al Suradarian lost $1,300 in frantic high-stakes card games. The money was losing all meaning as they moved closer to the front. The boredom was occasionally shattered by bursts of raw animal energy. On the deck, a crewman named Harry stepped into a boxing match, his professional fighting skills turning a simple bout into a jarring, violent display that left the onlookers in a stunned silence. They were no longer the boys from the Cleveland train station. As the New Amsterdam churned through the grey, heaving swells of the North Atlantic, the individual lives they had glimpsed during their final furloughs were being systematically erased. They were being replaced by the cold, grinding machinery of a war that demanded they become interchangeable parts of a weapon system. They were heading toward the largest aircraft carrier in the world. They were heading toward the rain-slicked, mud-choked airfields of England, where the flying coffin was waiting for them. But to understand the trial ahead, we must look at the world they were entering. Could these young men, so recently civilians, endure the cold reality of a combat base? The train ride through the English countryside was a journey into a world of charcoal shadows and bone-deep dampness. When the crew finally stepped off the transport at the airfield, they were not met with the rolling green hills of a travel poster. Instead, they found a landscape that looked like a bruised, muddy thumbprint. The air in Norfolk hung heavy with the smell of burnt coke and the metallic ozone tang of high-octane fuel. It was a scent that would eventually seep into their pores and stay there for months. This was Air Station 120, a sprawling industrial scar on the pastoral earth. To the young men of the heavy bomb group, the base was a jarring paradox. On one hand, there was a country club veneer, complete with ping-pong tables and a movie theater. On the other was the reality of the Nissen huts. These were corrugated metal tubes, where the walls sweated condensation, and the only warmth came from tiny temperamental stoves fed by stolen coal and old newspapers. They slept on English biscuits, which were 3 thin, hard squares of mattress that offered no comfort against the chill. They listened to the metallic stutter of the teletype in the distance. That sound functioned as the heartbeat of a machine preparing to consume them. The transition from trainee to combatant did not occur over the burning ruins of a German city. It happened during a routine practice mission over the English coast. The sky was a pale, watery blue as the Black Cat banked over a restricted zone. The crew was still operating with the relaxed detachment of their training flights in the States. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. Below them, British anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Their own allies were shooting at them. From the waist windows, Howard and the gunners watched in a state of paralyzed confusion as puffs of black smoke began to blossom around the wings. These were not the fluffy clouds of a weather report. They were oily, malignant bursts that rocked the 30-ton bomber with a series of dull, sickening thuds. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The war did not care about their uniforms or their intentions. The sky was a neutral, lethal space where a single navigational error transformed a friend into a target. As the pilot, Farrington, dove the ship away from the barrage, the high adventure of the Air Corps evaporated. The laughter on the interphone died, replaced by a heavy, static-filled silence. They had been fired upon. They were no longer students of war, but participants in a slaughter that made no distinction between a German 88mm and a British Bofors. This loss of innocence was reinforced by the grinding, 24-hour industrial cycle of the base. The war was a bureaucratic machine that hummed through the night. While the crew slept fitfully in their damp bunks, the administrative night was alive with the clatter of orders flowing from high command. At 0300, the human dawn arrived with a visceral, jarring finality. The sergeant in charge would move through the huts, his voice a bark that shattered the fragile peace of sleep. In the windowless gloom, the men would sit up, their breath materializing in tiny puffs of steam. They shaved with clammy, lukewarm water in the half-moon shack. The silence was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and the dread of the unknown. They were being processed for the day's mission. They were funneled toward the briefing room, where a black cloth concealed the map. It hid the red ribbon of the flight path like a secret too terrible to look at until the last possible second. But as the external pressure of the mission cycle intensified, the internal structure of the crew began to fray. The weapon system was composed of human nerves, and those nerves were beginning to snap. The friction centered on Harry, whose psychological architecture was collapsing under the weight of the Aleutian stare. This was the silent, moody detachment that signaled a man was drifting away from the group. The breaking point came during a mundane walk back from the mess hall. The air was cold and the ground was slick with Norfolk mud. The silence between the men was taut as a piano wire. Without warning, Harry's voice erupted into a violent, jagged outburst. It was not a rational argument. It was the sound of a man being hollowed out by fear and the claustrophobia of the base. He stood there in the yellow light of a blackout lantern, his face twisted into a terrifying mask of rage. His words were a stream of venom directed at the very men he was supposed to protect in the air. The cohesion of the crew shattered in that moment. This was the singular functioning unit forged in the heat of Miami and the thin air of the training grounds. They realized that the greatest threat was not just the flak or the German Air Force. It was the rot of exhaustion and the terrifying fragility of their own brotherhood. As they prepared for their next mission, the men of the Black Cat looked at one another and saw not just comrades, but strangers. They were strangers trapped in a metal tube, waiting for a sky that promised only more fire. The transition to lead crew status was not a promotion celebrated with champagne. It was a professionalization of terror. It was a bureaucratic elevation that turned the 10 men of the Black Cat into the primary target for every German gunner from the North Sea to the Ruhr. The decision was made with the cold and arbitrary logic of a coin toss. A major flipped a literal English penny to decide which pilots would carry the burden of the formation. By January 1945, the crew had moved beyond the anonymity of the tail-end Charlie position. They were now the brains of the heavy bomb group. They were responsible for the lives of nearly 40 other aircraft trailing in their wake. This new reality was physically manifested in the Mickey ship. This was a B-24 modified with the H-2X radar system. The bull turret, once the claustrophobic home of the gunner, had been ripped out and replaced by a retractable radome. Inside the fuselage, the air was now supercharged with the ozone tang of high-voltage electronics and the frantic ticking of the radar scanner. The crew established their reputation as masters of this new warfare on a morning when the East Anglian fog had turned the world into a bowl of thick grey milk. The mission was over, but the real battle began at the edge of the Attlebridge runway. The sky was a soup so dense that the wingtips of the Black Cat were mere ghosts in the mist. Inside the cockpit, Richard Farrington and Jack Regan sat in a state of hyper-focused silence. Their eyes were locked on the glowing phosphorescence of the instrument panel. There was no horizon, and there was no earth. There was only the erratic dancing of needles in the nose. John Murphy crouched over his radar scope with his face bathed in a sickly green light. He was not looking at the physical world. He was looking at the electronic skeleton of Norfolk. Left 5 degrees and steady, his voice crackled over the interphone, stripped of all emotion. The descent was a slow-motion plunge into the void. At 500 feet, the smell of damp earth and rotting vegetation began to seep through the vents. At 300 feet, the skeletal silhouettes of the village trees suddenly whipped past the cockpit windows like jagged teeth. The crew held their breath as the hydraulic pumps whined and the engines thrummed. Then the ground appeared as a black and rain-slicked ribbon of tarmac rushing up to meet them. The Black Cat did not so much land as it skittered across the ice-filmed runway like a flat stone thrown across a pond. When the tires finally bit and the landing gear groaned, the tension in the cockpit broke with a collective and shuddering exhale. They had conquered the weather, but they had also proven they were ready for the coffin corner. This elite status brought with it a relentless and grinding attrition. To be a lead crew was to be the co-pilot of death. They were now steering the formation into the most heavily defended airspace in the Third Reich. Throughout February, the target was almost always the same. They flew against the synthetic oil plants like Sterkrade and Bottrop. These were the refineries of the Ruhr. They were industrial fortresses protected by hundreds of radar-directed 88mm flak guns. The missions were no longer about the adrenaline of the dogfight. They were about the psychological endurance of the flak run. For 2.5 minutes before the bombs were released, the Black Cat had to fly straight and level. They were sitting ducks for the German batteries below. The sound of the flak was a rhythmic and hollow clatter-thump, like iron bolts being poured into a tin bucket. Inside the waist, Howard Goodner could feel the concussions rattling his teeth. The smell of spent cordite and frozen sweat filled his oxygen mask until he felt he was drowning in the scent of war. The pace of life became a surreal and unnatural oscillation between industrial slaughter and a desperate normalcy. One afternoon, the men were watching a bomber in the next box spiral down, like a burning kite, while they counted the parachutes that never opened. 6 hours later, they were crammed into the back of a truck, bouncing toward the city of Norwich. The transition was a sensory whiplash. They moved from the sub-zero and oxygen-starved silence of 25,000 feet into the greasy warmth of a dance hall. Under the dim blackout lamps, the smell of aviation fuel used to clean their uniforms mingled with the scent of cheap perfume and fried fish. The military police stood like bubbles of foam on the edge of the crowd as the airmen jitterbugged with a frantic and bone-deep intensity. Bob Peterson would lose himself in the swing of the music, his face a pale mask of exhaustion. But the war was always waiting in the shadows. They would return to the base in the pre-dawn chill to find the empty bunk syndrome had struck again. They would walk into the hut to find 5 bunks stripped bare. The personal effects of a neighboring crew were already packed into corrugated boxes by the clerks. There was no funeral and there was no eulogy. There was only the sight of the bare springs and the lingering smell of a man's tobacco. The Aleutian stare began to settle over the crew of the Black Cat. It was a silent and moody detachment that served as their only armor against a world where they were the primary targets. By April 21, 1945, the Third Reich was a shattered and guttering candle. Yet the bureaucratic inertia of the Allied High Command continued to demand blood for targets that no longer mattered. A phantom intelligence myth suggested Hitler would retreat to a mountain fortress for a final and apocalyptic stand. This drive for the Alpine redoubt sent the crew toward a railroad viaduct in Salzburg. It was a strategic absurdity. The war was statistically won. But for the crew of the Black Cat, the map still bore the lethal red circles of Regensburg. It was a hornet's nest of radar-directed 88mm batteries that did not know the war was over. Now we return to that freezing and chaotic void, 10,000 feet above the German soil. The command pilot Louis Wieser had ignored the recall orders and the frantic warnings of his navigator. He steered the 30-ton Liberator directly into a wall of iron. The whoomp of the flak was the final sound of their military lives. When the wing sheared off and the jet of orange flame erupted, the Black Cat became a centrifuge of screaming metal. The world was a blur of spinning horizon and oil-slicked floorboards. The centrifugal force was an invisible anvil. It pinned Howard Gardner and the others against the fuselage with such violence that reaching for a parachute ripcord felt like trying to lift a mountain. The metallic shrieking of the airframe drowned out any last words. The aircraft flipped, and the tail assembly tore away. The remains of the ship plummeted toward the wheat fields of Scharmassing in a terminal and vertical lurch. From the ground, looking up, the fog of war descended in an instant. Inside the neighboring bombers, young men peered through the black smoke and oil, their eyes straining to count the white blossoms of parachutes. The reports that filtered back to the heavy bomber group were a chaotic mess of contradictions. Some crews swore they saw a single shoot. Others were certain they counted 3, and one frantic witness claimed 5 men had escaped the fire. This discrepancy was the birth of a long and lingering nightmare. In the clinical language of the military bureaucracy, the crew was listed as missing in action. It was a status that offered no closure, only a jagged and agonizing hope that would haunt their families for years to come. The war ended for the world in May of 1945, marked by the Missouri twang of President Truman and the jubilant roar of the crowds in Times Square. But in the red brick neighborhoods of Chicago and the quiet corners of Tennessee, the victory was a hollow and silent thing. For Mildred Gardner, the war had moved from a map of Europe to the terrifying sound of the Western Union truck tires on the trolley tracks. The long vigil began with the arrival of the bone-colored envelopes. To receive a missing telegram was to be cast into a state of suspended grief, where every ringing telephone was either a potential miracle or a death sentence. Then came the letter that shattered the fragile peace of the families. Albert Seredarian, the 19-year-old tail gunner and one of the few to claw his way out of the spinning wreckage, wrote home from a hospital bed. His words were ambiguous, fueled by his own trauma and the hazy, flickering memories of the crash. He spoke of the other boys in a way that suggested they might still be out there, perhaps recovering in a German hospital or waiting in a displaced persons camp. This single piece of correspondence triggered a wildfire of false hope. The families began a decentralized intelligence network, comparing notes and reading the gunner's words 10,000 times. They became convinced that a miracle was unfolding before their eyes. They refused to cash government checks and left welcome home signs hanging in the windows. They prayed to a god of survivors, refusing to believe the sky had claimed them. But the military machine was eventually finished with its paperwork. The miracle narrative was systematically dismantled by the final arrival of the killed-in-action telegrams. One by one, the bone-colored envelopes were replaced by the cold finality of the state's regret. The transition from missing to dead was marked by the delivery of the Purple Hearts. When Mildred Gardner opened the small leatherette box, she did not find glory. She found a piece of metal resting on a smooth satin lining that felt, to the touch, like the interior of a coffin. The high adventure of the Air Corps had ended not in a victory parade, but in a quiet house in Tennessee. The Black Cat was gone, leaving behind only the hollow stare of the survivors and a void in the heart of the home front that no amount of celebratory bunting could ever fill. 40 years of silence settled over the Bavarian countryside like a thick and impenetrable fog. The violent end of the Black Cat became a collection of whispers and distorted local folklore. The official records in the National Archives had calcified into a nightmare of bureaucratic gaps. There were no German flak reports, only a chilling and one-word label for the event: Atrocity. This word became a vein of sorrow for the families, a jagged suspicion that Howard Gardner and Jack Brennan had not just died in a crash. They feared the men had been murdered by a vengeful mob in the final lawless hours of the war. The myth was fueled by rumors of a paraded execution and the memories of survivors who had been harassed by fearful farmers after their parachutes hit the silk. For decades, the truth remained buried beneath the surface, as elusive as the memories of the men who had managed to come home. The transition from these paper mysteries to the physical reality of the Earth began in the quiet, rainy hills near Regensburg. The investigation moved away from the sterile, air-conditioned rooms of the archives and into the tactile world of a local historian named Peter Schmoll. Together, the seekers navigated villages marked by onion-shaped steeple domes, bridging the gap between archival silence and the visceral memories of those who were children in 1945. They sat at kitchen tables where the air smelled of stale coffee and old wood. They listened to witnesses like Maria Wittig, whose voice trembled as she looked at a photograph of the crew. Her finger landed on Howard's face. She whispered that she could still see him before her, recalling the handsome flyer she had found in her family's field. This was the moment the atrocity myth began to dissolve, replaced by a grimmer and more mechanical truth. The forensic evidence was found not in rumors of beatings, but in the clinical assessment of a medical officer named Dr. Edward Snyder. The black cat had not just crashed, it had been driven into the earth with such cataclysmic force that the bodies were sunken 20 to 30 centimeters into the ground. The deep, broad trough of the impact site was a testament to a high-velocity fall that made a beating both unnecessary and impossible. The injuries were consistent with the physics of a plummeting 30-ton machine, not the work of a civilian mob. The nightmare of potential murder was traded for the terminal finality of a high-altitude rupture. It was a realization that offered a painful and hollow kind of closure. The heart of this historical reckoning unfolded in the waist-high wheat fields of Scharmesing during the spring ploughing. The sun was a pale disk in the Bavarian sky, and the air carried the sharp, damp scent of freshly turned loam and diesel exhaust. A modern tractor moved rhythmically across the land, its massive tires churning the earth where the black cat had made its final, vertical lurch. As the steel blades of the plow bit into the furrows, the past refused to stay buried. With every pass, the soil coughed up shimmering specters of the war. Small, jagged fragments of duralumin appeared in the dirt. Shards of plexiglass from the nose turret and rusted .50 caliber cartridge casings glinted like gold in the mud. The investigator stood in the wake of the tractor, the vibration of the engine humming through the soles of his boots. He reached down into the cold, wet mud and pulled out a piece of the airframe, its edges still sharp enough to draw blood. It was a fragment of the tail assembly, a physical surrogate for the men who had vanished into the fog of war. The field was a strange and haunted place, where green shoots of wheat pushed through the very earth that still cradled the shattered remains of the liberator. This was not a history textbook. It was a living and breathing encounter with a catastrophe that had been absorbed into the landscape. The smell of the damp earth mingled with the phantom scent of aviation fuel that seemed to linger in the memory of the site. The circle was finally closing. Not with a parade, but with the quiet recovery of the steel that had carried them into the night. The circle finally closed at the edge of that German field, a world away from the red silk-lined battle jackets of Tennessee or the cold bureaucratic files of the War Department. The investigation had moved past a swollen stream of contradictions and a state of suspended grief that had haunted the families for decades. Standing at the very spot where Howard and Jack Brennan were finally found, the long search for the truth reached its quiet and emotional peak. A simple birch cross was placed into the soil, its stark white wood standing in sharp contrast to the endless flowing green of the Bavarian wheat. 8 red roses were laid at its base. Their color was a vibrant and jarring reminder of the young lives spilled on that sullen morning in April of 1945. As those roses settled against the wood, the wings of memory finally offered the human closure that the state had failed to provide. The black cat was no longer a ghost story or a mystery hidden in the dusty archives of the Pentagon. It was now a part of the earth itself, a story of love and profound sorrow that had finally been brought home from the freezing void. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.